sea level rise workshop who are interested. So we're hoping that our recording system here on Bowen can help spread the word around. So without further ado though, thanks everybody for coming and thinking about our islands. I think we have to be a little more careful with an island, and take it away, Claude.
Thank you very much. As I was saying, let's go back to what I was saying. So I work for Living Ocean Society. I'm going to give you a little background of my own self. So it's always nice to know the person that is presenting. So you probably hear my accent. So I came from the East Coast in 1989 after a degree in business. And then maybe about 10 years ago, I decided to be part of the solution, not the problem. It's as cheesy as it sounds. So I went back to BCIT and did an advanced diploma in sustainability, business sustainability. After that, I thought I don't have enough schooling, so I decided to do a master's in Sweden in strategic leadership toward sustainability. And before that, I was working at Living Ocean Society, translating the entire website into French. So I guess when I came back from doing my master's, Karen, the executive director, felt compelled to give me a job. So because I translated the website for about 15 months without being paid. So I guess, you know, so much to say about volunteering. So about 3 years ago, I started working at Living Ocean Society. The first thing I worked on was sustainable seafood. Then I moved on to a big database of all the standardized or fish farms, salmon farms to be specific. So we looked at all the fish farms in the world and thought, okay, even though you have a sustainable MSC approval stamp on your farm, what does it mean? So we dig deep and found out that even though you're sustainable, it doesn't mean that they're good for the environment. So that big project took about a year to do, about 500 farms, so that was interesting. And now I'm talking about climate change and sea level rise. So that has been, as Gina was saying, this is the sixth one we're doing. So this is the first step in planning for sea level rise. Obviously, what I'm going to do today is try to give you some background on sea level rise. After that, we'll talk about solution and adaptation strategies, and then this is the first part of the presentation, and then we move on to, we'll do a little break, and then we come back and do a interactive exercises. There's about 2 exercises to do, so it's for the community to get involved and look at the map of Bowen and say, okay, what's happening and what can we do about it in future steps. So this is really the first step to think about sea level rise. So without further ado, I'm going to play this little video. So if you don't mind, I'm going to read my notes because there's a lot of stuff and I don't want to forget anything. So I want you to focus on the video, not me. No, just kidding. All right. So I'm sure you've noticed in the last few years that more extreme weather events are happening, more flooding, more erosion, more extreme storms. A couple of weeks ago there was a newspaper article about that, sea level rise. Sea level rise is not just a buzzword to put fear in us, but it's a process that is made worse by greenhouse gas emissions. Obviously, we hear different scenarios from extreme huge increase of 216 feet rise in sea level if all the land ice in the world melted, to small, which is the current rate of 3.2 millimeter a year, but it has doubled in the last 2 decades. And everything else in between, from 1 meter to 2.5 meters, depending on who you talk to. So which makes it very difficult to plan for sea level rise, right? The money we spend on climate change impacts is increasing. I mean, as I said, forest fires, floods, hurricanes is increasing every year. it can be confusing and overwhelming, but at the end of the day, what does it mean for you and your community? And how can you prepare yourself for it? What can you do about it? That's what today is all about. First, I'm going to talk a little bit about the agenda, which is on this wall. So if you see anything that you're not really comfortable with, let me know. But it's pretty straightforward. First, I've just done the introduction. The next one, what I will ask you to do is to introduce yourself clockwise with what you used to do, what you're doing job-wise, just to see what is the collective knowledge in the room. So that will be recorded for you to know that sometimes you don't even know, but there's a lot of smart people in the room and in your community. So we'll do that in a minute. I'll explain what sea level rise is, the impacts, and what can you do about it. We'll talk about an interactive map on sealevelrise.ca, which was a project that is ending today. There'll be a question period, followed by a break, and then we'll do some mapping, a couple of exercises as well. And that will wrap up the day at about 2.5 hours, give up or take. But I'm pretty good at keeping on track, because that's important. First, we're going to do a check-in question. So I'm going to stop that for a minute. So what I would like to do is to go clockwise, starting from the back. I'm going to give you a minute or two to think about it. But clockwise from the back, this way, introduce yourself and the role you do, the job you do or you used to do, if you don't mind. So I think Emma is the first person in the back. Sorry, are you chewing? I can wait a second. I can wait a second.
Sure. I'll go first.
Please do.
My name is Jennifer McGowan. I'm the Emergency Program Coordinator for the Bowen Island Municipality.
Thanks for coming. Emma, you want to go?
Yes. Thank you. My name is Emma Chow. I'm the Island Community Planner for Bowen Island Municipality.
Thanks for coming. I will go
My
with
name
this.
is Jack Headley. My wife Julie and I run a School of Theatre Arts on the island.
Nice, great. Would your wife mind introducing us?
I'm Julie Tessner, and I'm working with the children at the theatre school and have for a long time.
Nice one. Thanks for coming.
I'm Anne. I'm retired. I run an Airbnb
Oh, nice.
and do some cleaning of vacation rentals. So that's what I do as little jobs.
Great.
Other than that, I'm enjoying living on the island
And
and
social
stay here
media.
until the end of my days.
Good morning. Thank you for coming. What about this lady in the back?
Mary Molson, semi-retired now, sales and management.
Thank you for coming. The gentleman.
John Olson, lawyer, retired.
Great. Thanks for coming.
Anne Franca Ferrier, retired. I once was a geologist and I was quite involved with different projects on the island.
Great. Thank you for coming.
André Chola, retired too, and I used to develop private property or private gardens and things like that.
Thanks for coming. The gentleman right here.
Don Schaefer, semi-retired broadcaster, just finished my MA in climate change.
Nice. We have scientists in the room, so any questions, I'm going to direct out to
Your work is done here.
I'm going to sit down, I'm going to let this gentleman talk.
Betty Morton, retired nonprofit ED, systems change leadership in my area.
Thanks for coming. Lots of interesting people.
I'm Bill Granger. I'm a retired manager of Parks and Environmental Services.
Great.
Most recently with all three of the Tri-Cities, Port Moody, Port Coquitlam, and Coquitlam. Before that, for many years with the city of North Vancouver. And I finished my master's degree about 100 years ago. It seems.
You don't look at it.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming. This gentleman.
Brian Hodgins, retired teacher and resident of Bowen for 43 years.
Great. Good morning. I'm gonna skip to Lisa because I want her to introduce herself.
My name is Lisa Wrench. I work for the Bowen Island Community Foundation and property manager for Village Square and contract manager.
So we
And-
said taking minutes of this event.
Yes, Lisa said, and we very appreciate it. The gentleman here.
My name is Mark Edmonds. I'm the chair of the Municipal Parks, Trails and Greenways Advisory Committee, so we also advise on beaches and beach accesses. I also sit on the Environment and Climate Change Advisory Committee.
There you are. I don't need to do anything.
Great
sweater as well.
Right?
Yes.
I heard you ask it, I thought, yes, because it's game day.
Yes.
Oh,
Right?
boy.
Oh, no.
Miss Levy.
My name is Deb Appleby, and I'm a longtime summer resident of Bowen, of about 60 years. And I have a mother that's living on Bowen who's been here living permanently for about 50 years. And I've spent a lot of my time living in Mexico. And there I done various jobs, from school nurse to selling tours. And
Great.
all of them have been on the ocean.
Wow. Interesting. Thanks for coming.
Thank you.
What about this lady?
My name is Tana Slazel. I'm retired. I'm a longtime Bowen resident. Used to be a sports coach and love swimming in our oceans.
Good morning. Thank you for coming.
I'm Allison Morse, FCPA, and I'm a municipal councillor. I'm interested that you're not asking who's the waterfront property owner and who isn't, the group that's here.
Right. I think this is this is a good question. I will ask that after this, just to see a show of hand. But it also, it's geared for everybody. But you're right. Thanks for coming. What about this gentleman here?
Ronnie,
Oh.
you're on.
I'm Rondi Dyke. I run the marina here in the Cove.
Thanks for coming.
I'm
Judy.
Judy McLeod. I don't live on the island. I live in Tawasin, close to the beach. But I'm a municipal planning consultant, and I work for Bowen Island as the deputy approving officer for subdivisions.
Great. Thanks for coming.
I'm Will Husby.
Excuse me.
I call myself a recovering biologist. I'm the chair of the Municipal Environment and Climate Change Committee. I work as a consultant for parks and museums.
Great.
And I'm currently working with the Bowen Island Conservancy developing an atlas of marine resources around Bowen Island.
Nice. Very cool.
And of course, sea level change is part of it.
And I'm Sue Ellen Fast, Bowen Councillor and Islands Trust.
My name is Gary Ander, a longtime Bowen Island resident, off and on for about 50 years. My career was with Air Canada, flying airplanes there, which was lovely. And I've also got a construction company and still working on the island here.
And your other job?
And my other job, I'm temporarily the mayor of Bowen Island. That
Was
too.
Mr. Mayor?
Well,
all right, before I continue, this lady has why don't we do that? A show of a hand of anybody that lives along the coast, the waterfront. A good amount of people. Great. Excellent.
1 street away, just 5.
1 street away, you never know if it's flat.
That's right.
It's
not flat, it's up a hill.
Might not be 1 street away. Might have waterfront there.
And how about asking how many people use the shorelines?
Yeah.
Well, that's
everybody.
exactly. That's without saying.
Yeah.
Who uses the shoreline? There you go. So everybody. All right, let's continue this presentation. All right, before I begin, I'm going to talk about the project that's just ending now. So it's called ECOAST, the Educating Coastal Communities About Sea Level Rise. It was a collaboration between Ecology Action Center and DFO, the Department of Fisheries and Ocean, on the East Coast. And on the West Coast, it was funded all the workshops we've done by the Real Estate Foundation with the help of the Islands Trust. This particular workshop has been supported and funded completely by the Islands Trust. So this project was meant to make sense of the local science and communicate to the smaller communities like yours to support sea level rise planning. It includes developing a website, so check out www.sealevelrise.ca. Even though the project is finishing today, the website will be active for the next 2 years. We created sea level rise videos, infographics. There's a big interactive map, which I'm going to talk about in a moment, to record all local observations. People go on the map and say, this area is prone to erosion, so a good thing to do. We created a toolkit which we are going to use with the interactive exercise to help lead community discussion and engagement. A big part of the project are these workshops happening across Atlantic Canada and on the West Coast, also in New Brunswick as well. So it was to give you the tools and empower you and your community to start talking about sea level rise and taking actions about it. The project started in 2017 and ends today, although we are looking for funding to continue that particular project. So just to have and I'm sure there's a lot of intelligent people, and I'm sure I'm going to repeat myself, but just to make sure and to be on the same page, I'm going to give a little background on sea level rise. When you hear the term sea level rise, it most often refers to the average amount that the seas are rising on the planet, aka the global mean sea level rise. Even though some places are rising more than others, it's the same thing than saying that the average temperature on Earth is 16 degrees Celsius. We all know that some places are colder and some other places are much warmer. Right now, the seas are rising at a rate about twice as much as the rate of the last century. Even though it's different from place to place, in British Columbia, the government is working with two projections, 0.5 meter by 2050 and 1 meter by 2100. We know the Earth is increasingly warming up, resulting in two phenomena. The first one, thermal expansion. So just like water takes more space when you boil it, the ocean increases in volume as it heats up. Oceans absorb and stores 90% of the excess heat energy caused by greenhouse gases. That represents 40% of all the CO2 emitted into the atmosphere. For every degree increase in temperature, the ocean rises by 0.2 to 0.6 meter. The next one is the melting of land ice. So that is particularly including glaciers, ice caps, ice sheets, but not the melting of sea ice like icebergs. This is because iceberg displace more or less the same amount of water that is added to the ocean when it melts. Think of an ice cube in a glass full of water. When it melts, your glass doesn't overflow. So to recap, an increase in greenhouse gas emissions means a warmer planet, which means thermal expansion and melting of land ice, which causes sea level rise. Let's look at what it means for BC particularly. The plan for sea level rise, you need to consider the projection for BC for how much it will rise. For example, the 0.5 meter I mentioned by 2050. From that, you add storm surge, climatic cycles, El Nino, seasonal effects. You add to that the tide as well, highest high tides and all that. And to that you add the wave run up, the setup and swash. So all of these elements add up and will impact the waterfront properties, obviously, so utility buildings and future developments as well. So climate change, whatever you believe in doesn't really matter, right? So it's not about who believes in climate change, but what we'll do in the future as society does That matters. The question is, well, will there be more investment in renewable energies? Are we going to invent new technologies that will scrub the CO2 out of the atmosphere? Even if we were to stop CO2 emissions right now, we're still locking for what has been emitted so far. What will we do about greenhouse gases? So with population growth and what it entails, so the more people, more energy consumed, need more production of stuff, leading to an increase in greenhouse gases. Or will we aggressively decrease them, as I said, through initiatives and innovation? And what about if we were to do nothing about it, right? So one thing to keep in mind is the more we focus on cutting our emissions, the more this will translate into smaller increase in temperature of the planet, a cooler ocean, less money spent on adapting, and less damage to buildings and infrastructure. So most governments work with 4 main scenarios based on the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change. From a lower degree of greenhouse gas concentration of 2.6 to a higher of 8.5, which means an increase varying from 0.3 to 4.8 Celsius, depending on where you are, and all depending on what we'll do about CO2 emissions. So even though climate modeling is useful, weather patterns are extremely complex systems, right? That's why climate change scenarios are used, and they're called representative concentration pathways. Each scenario is a combination of factors like projected growth, economic activity, energy intensity, and technological innovation. So sea level rise is not going to impact us equally. What does it mean for you specifically? It's fine to talk about the global sea level rise, but what is the specific amount of water level change that you are experiencing in your location? Here are some examples of local sea level change. Campbell River, Ucluelet, so you see a rise in the 2050, 2100. All the scenarios that we talked from the lower to the highest, Vancouver being the last. This map is in centimeter for high emissions of 8.5, the highest we've seen, for 2100. So in the last 50 years, sea level rose by 3.1 centimeter in Victoria, 2 centimeter in Vancouver, but declined by 8.4 centimeter in Tofino. Why, do you ask, did Tofino decrease? Well, in Canada, one of the reasons that local sea level rise varies so much from one place to the other is because of vertical land movement or glacial isostatic adjustment. So what is that? 15,000 years ago, Canada was covered in a massive and heavy glacier, which caused the center of Canada to sink and the edges to rise. And once the glacier started melting, the center of Canada bounced back, as logically would do, and the edges began to sink. Here on the west coast, the land is sinking, or subsiding as they call it, except for Tofino and a few other places, where it is uplifting, and that is due in part by other factors. One of the factors is removal of natural resources, earthquakes, soil compaction. So in BC, on top of the considered impact of climate change, we need to consider vertical land movement as well in our planning. What sort of impacts are we associated with sea level rise? Inundation is where the land is permanently submerged to a rise in water level, creating a new normal sea level rise. If you live on top of a 3-meter cliff, a new normal water level, let's say of 2 meters, will not submerge your property if you live next to the ocean. But if you live on a low-lying land that has less than 1 meter elevation, this new 2-meter normal level is going to cause you lots of damage. Even if your new normal water level may not flood your house, if you're higher, it does bring high tides and storm surge a little closer. Coastal flooding is the next one, and that is the temporary flooding of land by seawater. and is often the result of storm surge. It is not the same thing that overland flooding, which happens when there's intense rainfall. You all know what storm surge is, I'm sure. It's the increase in wave height and from high winds and weather conditions. A good example of that is in 2003, Hurricane Juan caused storm surge in Halifax of 1.63 meter. Extreme water level, yes. Extreme thirst as well. Let's go back to that same example, 3-meter cliff. So you include a 2-meter sea level rise, you add storm surge and high tides, and you get extreme water levels, causing all kind of damage to your property as well. So, and the last to think about is saltwater intrusion. Not the last, sorry, the one before last. So it happens when salt water seeps into the fresh groundwater, impacting your drinking water if you have a well, resulting in killing off the vegetation and impacting freshwater species as well. And finally, coastal erosion. So it happens when rock and sediments are removed by the currents and wave action. So the rate of which depends on the wind, the waves, and the strengths, and the type of land formed. So is it a beach? Is it a dune? Are these soft cliffs? These will erode at a faster rate than rocky ones. Sea level rise doesn't cause erosion directly, but it creates deeper water levels, which means stronger waves to reach the shores and then cause more erosion. So what can you do? Can you and your community do about sea level rise? So when it comes to sea level rise, you really don't have any other choices than to adapt, which is to say using techniques to reduce the effect of sea level rise on your community. 4 categories of options. The first one is protect. By building structures to account for sea level rise, keep the position of the shoreline at the same distance. Accommodate, manage the way the coast is used to minimize the risk to human and infrastructure. Retreat, relocating people and buildings. Or avoid. Avoid is to prevent new development in at-risk areas. So to know that, you need to have a baseline analysis of that. Within these approaches, there's a slew of options available, so obviously you can use a combination of all these approaches and more. So let's give you a sea level rise tools and best practices, a little overview of what could be. The first one that comes to mind, because it's government-led, it's Canadian Extreme Water Level Adaptation Tool, the CAN unit. So it's vertical allowance, how high above current sea levels new infrastructure needs to be built or old ones need to be modified to accommodate for sea level rise and to maintain the current level of flooding risk in a future scenario of sea level rise. These are based on historical records, including both tides and storm surge, and also the vertical land movement, the sinking or the uplifting of the land. If you go to the website, it gives you the vertical allowance needed for those locations which have a, what do you call that?
Bar, graph?
No, it's a tide gauge, sorry, in each of those locations. For a medium and high RCP scenario, the representative concentration pathways we talked about. You can also see specific sea level rise for each location. Note for critical infrastructure, you need a greater vertical allowance. Obviously, it makes sense. In BC, the flood construction level, I'm going to stop that for a second. I just want to finish what I'm saying. In BC, the flood construction level right now is, as a guideline, is 1.5 meter above the national boundary. We'll come back to that in a minute. Horizontal setback. So I think on board you have a 30-meter horizontal setback as it stands. You also have possibility if there's if it's analyzed by a professional to have it at 15 meters or 7.5 meter. And in some rare case with variance, there was one case at 3.4 meter, if I'm remembering well. So Horizontal setback is the recommended distance away from the coast that infrastructure should be built at. It provides a buffer between you and the coast, reduce infrastructure damage and public risk, and can be created at the municipal level. 15 meters from estimated location of future natural boundary for the Strait of Georgia, and 30 meters outside of the strait. Buffers means also horizontal setbacks, so some of them. Vegetated horizontal setback, it helps retain and restore natural vegetation along the coast. It creates a natural transition zone between the shoreline and the human development. It restores coastal habitat and enhance water quality as well. Living shorelines is a good example of that. That's a buffer, a horizontal setback buffer. It's a method of coastal management that uses native plants to replicate and support natural ecosystem functioning. When we build hard seawalls, roads, or put rocks along the eroding shorelines, we are altering the way the coast naturally behaves. So this often causes problems for our neighbors and can limit the coast's ability to adapt. It's creating a domino effect by impeding natural processes and sediment transportation. Living Shorelines, there's an organization that gives free workshops on living shorelines. So that could be a potential workshop for you to have on the island, for this lady to come and talk about it. There's some pictures in the back of the before and after, what it really does, if that interests you. We'll come back to that in a moment. Living shorelines it's called a softer approach. It's called bioengineering. It attempts to mimic natural coastal processes. It includes stabilizing slopes through planting vegetation or upland forests, maintaining and restoring beaches and marshes, and re-establishing the intertidal zones. These methods serve to slow erosion and increase protection from flooding. Another similar method is the use of biotechnical measures, which are old techniques that have been used for centuries in Europe. They use basic engineering principles mixed with plant science for stabilization improvement. They're cost-effective, they're nature-enhancing, and more pleasing to the eyes than traditional structures. Those are pictures that are also laminated if you want. Another tool to address sea level rise is coastal policies and strategies in British Columbia. So those policies or strategies are useful for providing leadership and best practices when it comes to managing the coast. Each province, municipality, First Nation, or trust communities have their own needs, largely based on the sea level rise impacts they're facing. So in BC, as of January 2018, there are the flood hazard area land use management guidelines that incorporates sea level rise into building setbacks and flood construction. As I mentioned, 50 meters from future estimated natural boundary for this, within the Strait of Georgia, and 30 meters outside of the strait. The Local Government Act mentioned that local governments like yours have exclusive power within the jurisdiction to designate floodplains, assess the risk, and integrate this into planning policies. So as I was reading, I'm going to do a summary in a minute. As I was reading your OCP and your DPA, it's mostly about addressing the fact that Bowen Island is one of the richest island when it comes to ecosystems. 78% of its largest percentage of natural ecosystem is on Bowen Island, sorry. It's 78% compared to 85% for Gambier, so which is the highest. the goal is to develop and initiate climate action programs that address greenhouse gas reduction, energy planning, corporate carbon neutrality, support climate action-based community initiatives, to name a few. 8 components of the OCP related to environment. Where are the environmentally sensitive areas, the steep slope areas, climate change mitigation, terrestrial features, freshwater resources, marine resources, foreshores. All of these are included in your OCP. A lot of things mention erosion and keeping wetlands, working and making sure that all that is to protect and preserve the coastal vegetation. One thing that I thought was interesting, because it could be a solution, artificial reefs are not acceptable if you were to be on a creative side of how to address sea level rise, except small-scale habitat enhancement structures known as reef balls. So reef balls, lots of that is done on the East Coast. There's about 390 reef balls which are made of concrete. They are breathable in some ways. They have holes for natural vegetation to grow in, for the fish to be protected and breed. They drop about 390 of those reef balls in the Halifax Bay area. And one side effect of that is that it reduces erosion, which would be much greater than a rock breakwater. So it has a better and a higher result than using hard structures. So, and also it helps with scour, because breakwaters do have scour effect, which creates more problem than more erosion and all that. So I thought that was